For starters, I would like to draw your attention to a few lines from the Elegy on John Donne, written by Thomas Carew. I think the name can also be pronounced as Carey. In fact, Carey is the older pronunciation, but today, in most dialects, in most registers, the name is pronounced as Carew. In this passage, Thomas Carew observes that the garden of the Muses was overgrown with weeds, with pedantic weeds. You must remember that John Donne was a great scholar, but his scholarship never converted him into a pedant. And John Donne, the energetic John Donne, the innovative John Donne, de-weeded the garden, removed the weeds, threw away the seeds of servile imitation, discarded the seeds of slavish imitation, and planted fresh invention in the garden. I think this passage succeeds in highlighting the single most remarkable achievement of John Donne as a poet. That is a poet like no other. In fact, if you ask me to utter one word in relation to his achievement, to John Donne's achievement as a poet, I would say originality. He is one of the most original, one of the least imitative of the poets in the English language. And it is this outstanding originality that is brought under the focus by Thomas Carew in this passage. A typical John Donne poem surprises us, stuns us, shocks us at every turn, because the poet says things which hardly any other poet would say. This outstanding originality, this remarkable originality, is very much visible in the present poem. And I would say that this originality begins with the title of the poem, The Blossom. The poem has a very ordinary, a very commonplace title, The Blossom. The blossom means the flower. Usually we use the term in its plural form. Blossoms, flowers, especially on a tree or a plant. When I read the poem for the first time, I thought it was by William Wordsworth. I read the poem for the first time, I think it is by William Wordsworth. It is a nature poem. It's about a flower, how beautiful the flower is, how the flower inspires the speaker, how the flower provides psychological succor and spiritual solace to the speaker. A typical William Wordsworth poem. But then I realized it's not by William Wordsworth, but by John Donne. And so I corrected my expectations. I knew that I could not harbor any expectations about the poem. In the case of a John Donne poem, you have to expect the unexpected. Anyway, the poet has chosen a very simple, very ordinary title for the poem in order to raise certain false expectations in the mind of the reader. That's a typical gambit of John Donne, opening gambit of John Donne. The title of the poem is The Blossom. The word blossom is a noun which means flower, bloom. As I said, it's more often used in its plural form. But it can also be a verb. And I think the word blossom is applicable to the body of the poem. The title of the poem, Blossom, is applicable to the body of the poem as a noun and also as a verb. Because when you read the poem, you realize that it is about a relationship. How the relationship blossoms, or rather, refuses to blossom. How the relationship unfolds, how the relationship develops. So here we have a typical title, typical characteristic John Donne title, simple ordinary word, applicable to the body of the poem, both in its noun form and also in its verb form, and a title which in the mind of the unsuspecting reader generates, deliberately generates false expectations. I think we have to congratulate the poet, we have to congratulate John Donne for choosing this deceptively simple title. This deceptively simple but actually striking title for his poem. The opening stanza of the poem gives powerful expression to the tendencies latent in the title of the poem. The title of the poem is The Blossom. And in the first stanza, the focus is on the flower. It's clear from the stanza that there is a very close relationship between the speaker and the flower. The speaker has seen it being born. It's only a few days old. The speaker has seen it being born and has observed it on an hourly basis, has watched its development from stage to stage, and now the flower has reached the peak of its glory. It laughs, it triumphs on the bough. The flower has attained the highest point in its trajectory to glory. If you read the lines carefully, you can notice a growing wedge, a growing gap between the speaker and the object, between the speaker and the flower. To begin with, the speaker observes the flower carefully, its birth, its development on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. He is somewhat like a mother watching over her sick baby But as we proceed forward, we realize that an emotional gap is developing between the speaker and the flower as he sees the flower laughing, triumphing on the bough. The stanza concludes with a warning. It is winter, and it is going to freeze anon shortly, soon. Freeze means to turn liquid into solid as a result of cold. And the flower which is now laughing on the bough, triumphing on the bough, may be seen, will be seen by the speaker, fallen, or may not be seen by the speaker at all, will not be seen by the speaker at all. I'm reminded of the old English proverb, pride goes before a fall. The second last word in the first line, poor, is an expression of sympathy when we read the line for the first time, but when we conclude reading the stanza, it is an expression of mock sympathy rather than sympathy. When we read the line for the first time, we get the impression that the speaker loves the flower very much, and so he calls the flower poor flower, deserving sympathy, deserving pity, because he loves the flower very much. But when we conclude reading the stanza, we realize that the word poor is an expression of mock sympathy because it is winter, it's going to freeze shortly, and the flower is ignorant of its own coming fate, ignorant of its own disastrous future. And the word poor thus becomes an expression not of sympathy but of mock sympathy. The flower which is now laughing, triumphing on the bough will be seen, may be seen tomorrow by the speaker, fallen or not seen by the speaker at all. Thus, the poem begins with an apostrophe to the flower. This is a technique adopted by the poet in order to impart energy, vibrancy to the thematic trajectory of the poem right at the beginning, right at the opening of the poem. The apostrophe to the flower. The stanza also prepares the way for what is to come. We realize that the speaker very much loves the flower, that it's a relationship of close affection, that the speaker is very much concerned about the flower, and also that he is keenly aware of the dangers to come, which the flower is obviously ignorant of. Thus, it is a close relationship between the speaker and the flower, but it is not a relationship of perfect rapport. It is not a relationship of complete identification. I am here reminded of a very famous question at the closure of a very famous poem, Ode to the West Wind, of P.B. Shelley. If I remember it correctly, and I think I remember it correctly, this is how Shelley wraps up the poem. This is what Shelley asks at the closure of the poem. The trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? A very powerful question. But in the Donne poem, the idea is reversed. Donne attempts to stand the prophecy, or rather the question of Shelley, which of course is yet to be asked at that time, on its head. Donne seems to ask, if spring comes, can winter be far behind? Unfortunately for the flower, it seems to be unaware of this cycle of seasons, that the triumph, the joy, the laughter of today is transient, is temporary, and that tomorrow the speaker will have to see it fallen, or will have to see it not at all. The Blossom of John Donne is a flower poem. It deals with a blossom, a flower, on one level, in a literal sense, in a botanical sense, on one level. But it does not require much sophistication to realize that the blossom represents a person, a woman, with whom the speaker is romantically entangled. The Blossom of John Donne is a flower poem, and it would be profitable to bring into conjunction with The Blossom of John Donne another even more famous flower poem, A Red, Red Rose of Robert Burns. This is how the poem begins. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Both are flower poems, but when you read The Blossom of John Donne, after reading A Red, Red Rose of Robert Burns, you realize how much more sophisticated, nuanced, complex the Donne poem is. The trajectory of the Burns poem, the thematic trajectory of the Burns poem, traces a simple, straight line. There are no twists and turns. There is nothing unexpected in the movement of the thematic trajectory. And I hope I am not hurting the feelings of the admirers of Robert Burns when I say that the Donne poem is more sophisticated, more advanced, more complex than the Burns poem. After reading the Burns poem, you feel that Robert Burns is a schoolboy of a poet, while after reading the Donne poem, you feel that John Donne is a professor or a poet. The second stanza is also an apostrophe. In the first stanza, the speaker apostrophizes the flower. In the second stanza, the speaker apostrophizes his own heart. That is the brilliance of Donne. Two apostrophes, one succeeding the other, one placed in conjunction with the other. It is clear when we read the second stanza that there is some kind of a romantic entanglement between the speaker and the flower. The flower, the blossom, is no mere flower, no mere blossom. It represents a woman. And you must note that there's a striking structural parallelism between the two stanzas. Little thinkest thou, poor flower, and little thinkest thou, poor heart. The idea is to establish a connection between the flower and the heart. But you must realize that the speaker is more than his own heart. The heart of the speaker is part of the speaker, but the speaker is not the heart alone. That labourest yet to nestle thee. To nestle means to settle comfortably, to lie down comfortably. Here labour is used as a verb that works hard, yet still even now. That works hard even now to nestle thee. The heart wants to provide a very comfortable, a very cozy space within itself to the flower, even now, even at this stage. What kind of tree is it to get a part in a forbidden or forbidding tree? It is a forbidden tree, or it is a forbidding tree. To hover means to remain in the same place in the air by fluttering the wings. It is usually said of a bird or maybe of a helicopter. To remain more or less in the same position in the air, or it can mean to wait eagerly and nervously. Waiters hovering near the tables of the rich. Here it means that the heart seems to believe that by hanging around the flower, it can get a part in the tree. The heart doesn't want to leave the place, it wants to hang around the flower. And it believes that by hanging around the flower, it will manage to get a part in the tree. A forbidden tree is a tree which is banned, which is not allowed. If something which is forbidden is something which is banned, something which is not permitted, something which is not allowed. We have in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Bible, the forbidden tree. And the Lord God commanded the man, of every tree in the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat. Genesis 2:16, 17. So that is a forbidden tree on which there is a ban, whose fruit man shall not eat. So, in this poem, the tree is forbidden, it is banned, it is not allowed, it is not permitted, or forbidding tree. Forbidding means intimidating, threatening, something which puts you off. The poet says that the heart desires a part in the forbidden or forbidding tree. There are two aspects to it. One is the tree is beyond the ambit of permission. For some reason, you cannot go to the tree. You cannot get for yourself a part in the tree. The other aspect is that the tree itself is intimidating, threatening. It puts you off. Why does the poet use or? When I was a student and when I was reading this poem for the first time, I wondered why Donne used the connecting word or. He could have used and. On the one hand, the tree is forbidden, banned, not permitted, not allowed. On the other hand, the tree is intimidating, frightening. But the poet uses the connecting word or because he wants to link in a close manner the two aspects. It is not clear to the speaker what the real problem is. The fact is that it is a forbidden tree. He is not allowed to get a part in the tree. It is also true that the tree itself does not welcome his attentions fully. It is intimidating, threatening. By deliberately using the connecting term or, Donne, the gifted poet, in a very planned manner, in a very deliberate manner, creates a sort of confusion. It is not clear what the real problem is. On the one hand, the tree is beyond the ambit of permission. It is the forbidden tree, like the forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden, like the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. On the other hand, the tree itself does not seem to welcome the speaker's attentions fully. It is intimidating, threatening. He wants to merge the two aspects. He wants to interlink the two aspects, integrate the two aspects. And in order to achieve that merger effect, the poet uses the connecting term or. It's not clear, a sort of confusion is deliberately created. Whatever be the reality, the fact is that the tree is beyond the ambit of permission, and also perhaps because of that, perhaps it may not be because of that, and also intimidating, threatening, and adopting an unwelcome an approach which does not welcome the attentions of the speaker, and helpest her stiffness by long siege to bow. The heart hopes that by a long siege, a siege is a military operation in which the forces encircle a town or a city or a fortress or a building and cut off supplies, helping to make the town or the city or the fortress or the building surrender. Here the heart helps that by encircling the flower continuously, by launching an operation which is very similar to the military operation of a siege, the stiffness can be bowed. The stiffness of the flower. Stiffness, I think, here means unfriendly approach, attitude which is not relaxed, severe, something which is severe, attitude which is severe, which is strong. To bow here means to overcome. That is the hope of the heart. The heart helps that by conducting a siege, by encircling the flower continuously, it will be able to overcome the stiffness of the flower, and the flower will ultimately surrender. The thematic trajectory of the poem exhibits yet another twist. When the speaker says at the closure of the second stanza that the heart does not realize that tomorrow, ere means before, the sun wakes, before sunrise, the heart has to undertake a journey along with this sun and me. The heart is hovering over the flower. The heart is conducting a siege around the flower. But the heart does not realize that tomorrow, before sunrise, before the sun wakes, the heart has to undertake a journey along with the sun and me. I would like to pause and pose a question here. From where do these lines draw their extraordinary power? How come that these lines are so remarkably powerful? The answer is that these lines are powerful because they are rooted in the personal life of the poet. They are rooted in the autobiography of the poet. As a young man, John Donne spent much of his money on women and travel. I think they are two very closely related expenses. John Donne's contemporary, Richard Baker, has been recorded as saying of John Donne that he, John Donne, was a great visitor of ladies, a great visitor of ladies. Before I leave this stanza, I would like to focus some attention on one particular line in the stanza, the fifth line, the fourth last line, a line which is positioned more or less in the middle of the stanza, the fifth line, the fourth last line. And helpest her stiffness by long siege to bow. I repeat, and helpest her stiffness by long siege to bow. What does it mean? The speaker's heart hopes that the resistance of the woman can be overcome ultimately by a long and organized operation. The heart of the speaker believes that ultimately the woman can be made to surrender. And in the context of Donne, it means surrender not merely her heart but also her body. Because John Donne is a poet for whom the body is very important. Reading this line in the contextual framework of the poem and the contextual framework of the corpus of Donne, I am driven to the conclusion that when the poet speaks of bowing the stiffness of the woman by long siege, he has in his mind not merely the conquest of the heart of the woman, but the conquest of the body of the woman as well. I would like to work out a contrast between this and the sonnets of Petrarch, through which Petrarch poured his worship, his adoration for Laura. If I say that Petrarch was completely not interested in the body of Laura, I would fail to be accurate. After all, Petrarch was a human being. Petrarch was a man, and he very much wanted not merely the heart of Laura, but also the body of Laura. But the fact is that the relationship between Petrarch and Laura, which is celebrated so beautifully in the sonnets of Petrarch, had absolutely no physicality, absolutely no sexuality, which is fulfilled. There was no physical contact between Petrarch and Laura. In fact, hardly any contact. And though we can sense a strong physicality, a strong sexuality in the sonnets, we are constantly reminded of the fact that the physical desires, the sexual desires of Petrarch remain completely unfulfilled. I would say that Donne and Petrarch seem to occupy two polar positions in the matter. For Donne, the body is very important. The physical needs, the sexual needs have to be fulfilled. For Petrarch, the body is important, certainly, but he is ready to worship Laura, even if his physical needs, his sexual needs remain completely unfulfilled. In the third stanza, the speaker continues to address his heart. The problem with the speaker's heart is that it is subtle, it is sophisticated, it is nuanced, it is capable of making fine distinctions. It has the capacity to carry out hair-splitting operations. It is too subtle for its own good. The speaker says that his heart is subtle, and by being subtle, it plagues itself, it troubles itself, it torments itself, it causes distress to itself. It loves to be subtle and to plague itself through its subtlety. So the heart tells the speaker, if you want to go, what's that to me? In what way does it affect me? If you want to go, if you must go, you can go. That does not affect me. Here is my business, here is my interest, here is my activity, and here I will stay. Here we find a dichotomy between the speaker and the speaker's own heart. The speaker has to go away, but the heart, which is obsessed with the flower, is not willing to accompany the speaker. The heart says that if the speaker wants to go, he is most welcome to go, because it does not affect the heart. The heart has its business here, has its activity here, and it will remain here. The heart now amplifies on what it has said and advises the speaker to go to friends whose love and means present various content, whose love, whose passion, obviously for the speaker, and whose means, resources, wherewithal, present, offer, give various types of satisfaction, various content. The heart says that the speaker can go to his friends whose love for him and whose resources are capable of providing him with various types of satisfaction, various content to your eyes, ears, and taste, and every part. If then your body go, what need your heart? The remarkable contrast here is between the relationship between the heart of the speaker and the flower, which of course represents a woman. And it is a relationship completely lacking in physicality, and the relationship that the speaker enjoys with his friends who give him content, who give him various kinds of satisfaction, who satisfy his eyes, ears, taste, in fact, every part of his body. And this is a relationship which is charged with physicality, which is charged with sexuality. So you have, on the one hand, a relationship totally devoid of physicality, and on the other, relationships which are charged with physicality. And the heart of the speaker tells the speaker, if then your body go, what need your heart? You can go with your body and meet your friends, and your friends will provide you with various kinds of satisfaction. They will satisfy every part of your body. You're welcome to do that. If your body goes with you and gets full satisfaction from your friends, why do you need a heart? The heart's point is that the heart will remain here and hover around the flower, hang around the flower, which of course represents a woman. I would like to draw your attention to the relationship between Astrophil and Stella in Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, which is comparable to the relationship between the heart of the speaker in the present poem and the flower, which of course stands for a woman. I would also like to draw your attention to the relationship between the speaker in the sonnets of Shakespeare, in the sonnets of William Shakespeare, and the Dark Lady, which is comparable to the relationship between the speaker in the present poem and his friends who take care to satisfy every part of the speaker's body. So on the one hand, you have Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. On the other hand, you have William Shakespeare's Speaker and the Dark Lady. And in the present poem, you have two relationships which invite comparison with these two very famous relationships in English poetry. One of the reasons why I say that John Donne is a very great poet, in fact, much greater than many of the so called great poets of the English language, is that his vision is sophisticated and holistic. We have been reading just three stanzas and see how the poet presents the experience of love. Love for Donne on the basis of these lines, these three stanzas, is not something unidimensional, not something monochromatic. It has numerous facets, and we are made to realize that. This is very unlike the love that we meet with, say, in Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella. And this is quite comparable to the love that we meet with in Shakespeare. The holistic vision of John Donne, his capacity to present something in a multi-dimensional manner, his capacity to throw light on its numerous facets. It's doubtful how many of the so-called great poets of the English language are capable of doing this with such subtlety, such sophistication, such elan. In the third stanza, at the close of the third stanza, the heart tells the speaker that he can go to London And if his body goes with him, he does not need his heart. This interaction is continued into the fourth stanza. At the beginning of the fourth stanza, the speaker tells his heart, if you want to remain here, well, you remain here and do your most. You must remember that all this conversation, all this interaction is taking place within the same individual. I feel tempted to relate these lines of Donne with a rather contemporary theory in psychology, the theory of the multiple self. Some years back, I happened to read a book by David Lester, the British American psychologist. The book is titled A Multiple Self Theory of Personality. A multiple self theory of personality. It is not merely David Lester, quite a few theorists today who challenge the unified personality theory. Within the self, according to them, there are quite a few selves. No human being possesses a monolithic personality. This is precisely what we are seeing in the Donne poem. The conversation, the interaction within the speaker. Within the speaker suggests that John Donne seems to believe in what is now known as the multiple self theory. The theory which holds that within every self there are quite a few selves. And there is much difference, much friction among these selves. The fourth stanza is vintage Donne. In this stanza, the poet displays his robust aptitude for the body, B-O-D-Y, as well as for the body, B-A-W-D-Y. The speaker's heart desires to stay there. We are not told where this place is, but in all likelihood, it is very probably a God-forsaken village quite far from London. The poet permits his heart to stay there. The poet tells his heart, you stay there and do your most, do your best, try your best. But the poet also gives a word of warning to the heart, to his heart. He explains to his heart, a naked thinking heart that makes no show is to a woman but a kind of ghost. The problem with the speaker's heart is that the speaker's heart does not realize its real nature and what would be the real approach of the woman towards it. According to the speaker, a naked thinking heart, a heart which is not clothed, a heart which is not in a body, a naked thinking heart. The heart thinks, carries out intellectual exercises. It is not clothed in a body. It is a naked heart, a naked thinking heart that makes no show. A true heart, a genuine heart, a real heart, a good heart. But the heart refuses to make any show. Women want display. Women want outward expression. Every woman wants her lover to wear his heart on his sleeve. If the heart is a true heart, a real heart, a good heart, a genuine heart, but a heart which does not carry out display, well, it evokes only fear, dread, disgust in the woman. A naked thinking heart that makes no show is to a woman but a kind of ghost. A ghost is a soul which appears in the form of an apparition, a spectre. Typically, the ghost evokes feelings of fear, dread, disgust. Meeting a ghost is a scary experience. And for a woman, a heart without a body, a heart which does not carry out outward expressions, is only a kind of ghost. The poet now amplifies on this by posing a rhetorical question. How shall she know my heart? That's the fundamental problem, which the heart itself is not aware of. How will she recognize my heart? How shall she know my heart? Or, having none, know thee for one. A woman typically has no heart herself. Not having a heart, how can she recognize a heart? Not having a heart, how can she identify a heart when she sees a heart? What a lovely question. In the first phase of his life, in his youth, John Donne spent almost all his money on travel and women. And I think that his experiences with women, his personal experiences with women, form the bedrock on which these lines have been erected. These lines are very powerful lines because they have a ring of truth, because they are rooted in the personal reality of the poet, because they are based on the autobiography of the poet. Donne traveled as much as he could, conducted relationships with women as much as he could, and it is very probably based on these experiences that this rhetorical question has been posed. Well, I think there is some truth in what Donne says. If you disagree with me, please don't react in a violent manner, because in general, we frequently hear of men suffering cardiac arrests, heart attacks, but we almost never hear of women suffering cardiac arrests. What does this show? Physically, biologically, every man has a heart, but perhaps every woman does not have a heart. The heart is the part of the body which is present in the male of the species but which is absent from the female of the species. I think medical science is yet to become aware of this fundamental fact. According to the poet, this does not mean that a woman can never know something which is not part of her body. There is a certain part in the male anatomy which a woman might know through constant practice, even though it is absent from the female anatomy. But she will never ever know a heart. What is that part of the male body which a woman does not possess, but which a woman easily recognizes through practice? I don't have to tell you. As I said, Donne is a poet with an aptitude for the body and the body. I have a question for you. Can you imagine Lord Tennyson writing these lines? John Donne was no prude, as was William Shakespeare, as were most of his contemporaries, as were the Elizabethan writers, most of the Elizabethan writers and most of the Jacobean writers. I would like to bring into conjunction with the passage under discussion a couple of lines from the Duchess of Malfi or John Webster. And John Webster, you must remember, was a younger contemporary, a junior contemporary of John Donne. In the Duchess of Malfi, we find Ferdinand trying to block the remarriage of his sister, the Duchess of Malfi, who is a widow, while trying to sensitize the Duchess on the perils of remarriage. Ferdinand says, I quote, "And beware that part which like the lamprey hath never a bone in it." Unquote. I think it is from 1-2. I have not taught the Duchess of Malfi for quite some time, but I think it's from 1-2 of the Duchess of Malfi. Lamprey is an eel-like aquatic creature. What does Ferdinand say? And beware that part which like the lamprey had never a bone in it. This is from the 1708 edition. In the earlier editions, the 1623 edition, and in the 1640 edition, Ferdinand says, and women like that part. Instead of and beware that part, Ferdinand says, and women like that part, which like the lamprey hath never a bone in it. Lamprey, as I said, is an aquatic creature very much like an eel. an eel-like aquatic creature. And when the Duchess expresses her disgust, her outrage, by saying, "Fie, fie, sir," Ferdinand clarifies, "Nay, I mean the tongue." Of course, he does not mean the tongue. And you must remember, this is the brother speaking to the sister. Certainly something very vulgar, something very coarse, something we cannot imagine a brother telling his sister. But the fact is that Ferdinand has in his mind not the tongue, but a specific part of the anatomy, of the human anatomy, which is present in the male of the species, but which is absent from the female of the species. That particular part is the same. The part which is referred to in the Donne poem and also indirectly referred to in the Donne poem and also in the Duchess of Malfi is the same. I think that unlike Lord Tennyson, unlike the Victorians, the Elizabethans, the Jacobeans were now prudes. We now move to the last stanza. The speaker continues his conversation with his heart. He invites his heart to meet him in London. Meet me in London then. We have already been informed that the speaker is about to set out on a journey. Meet me in London then. The very name London, it is full of resonances, especially to students of English literature. London, especially to lovers of the English language. The capital of England and now the capital of the United Kingdom. At one point, the metropolis of the British Empire, the greatest empire that the world has ever seen. One of the greatest cities in the history of the world. It was Dr. Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who said, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life." And it is to that city, to London, that the speaker is going. And the speaker tells his heart, "Meet me in London then, 20 days hence, 20 days from now, less than 3 weeks from now. Meet me in London, and you will find me fresher and more fat by being with men. And thou shalt see me fresher and more fat by being with men." I am going to spend my time in London in the company of men. My friends are there in London. We are going to paint the town red. We are going to enjoy ourselves. And if you meet me 20 days from now in London, you will find me fresher and more fat. You will find me refreshed. There is the idiom, as fresh as a daisy. You will find me happier, fatter. This is an age in which We are obsessed with losing weight. We don't want to be fat. But the world of John Donne was a very different world. Being fat, being obese, being overweight, being overweight, being plump, being stout was seen as a symptom of happiness, of prosperity, of joy. And so the speaker tells his heart that his heart should meet him, invites his heart to meet him in London 20 days from now, and his heart will find that he has had a wonderful time, marvelous time, in the company of his friends, and he is now more fresh and more fat. Here we find a contrast between two things which are very different, but which can also be compared: friendship and love. Some years back, I remember reading a book titled Love and Friendship in Plato and Aristotle by Anthony Price, I think A.W. Price. It was published, if I'm not wrong, by OUP. On the one hand, you have friendship, on the other hand, you have love. Two very different things, but which can be profitably compared. And that is what the poet tries to do here. I think I've lost my voice. Please bear with me. In a way, it is good that I've lost my voice, because my students complain that, like the brook of Tennyson, I go on forever. That is what the brook says in Tennyson's poem, Lord Tennyson's poem, Alfred Tennyson's poem, The Brook. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. My students complain that I have a tendency to go on forever once I start speaking. So it is very good that I've lost my voice. Please excuse me. Returning to love and friendship. Here the poet tries to work out a contrast between friendship and love. He spends 20 days in London with his friends, and 20 days from now he will be more fresh and more fat, more happy, more refreshed, more joyous, and from the perspective of the world of Donne, more healthy than he would have been had he remained in the country with her and D. D is the speaker's heart, with the speaker's heart and the blossom, the woman who has conquered the heart of the speaker. I would like to sound a note of warning here. The poetry of Donne is complex, rich, and is capable of being explicated in several ways. I have given you, or I am trying to give you, what I think is the best or the most appropriate interpretation of the lines. I do admit that other readings, other interpretations are quite possible. As it is, there's a general complaint that my classes are too detailed. So I give you just one reading, what I feel is the best reading, the most appropriate reading. That does not mean that this is the only interpretation, only reading. In the concluding lines, the speaker invites his heart to accompany him to London. As I said, more than one interpretation is possible, but this appears to me to be the most appropriate interpretation. And if the heart decides to come to London, the speaker will give his heart to a friend who will be happy to have both his body and his mind. Thus, at the closure of the poem, the speaker makes an attempt to persuade his heart to accompany him to London and explains what will happen in London. I will give you there to another friend whom we shall find as glad to have my body as my mind. I don't think I'm wholly right when I say that Donne stands Petrarch on his head. Of course, in a way he does. But love is not exclusively something in Donne. In Petrarch, love is almost exclusively emotional. It's almost exclusively from the heart. This is certainly not the case in Donne. Donne rejects Petrarch and love. If that is what is love, he doesn't want it. At the same time, Donne adopts a holistic perspective. Love is a totalizing experience which involves all the facets of the individual, all the dimensions of the individual. In Donne, love is physical, but it is not exclusively physical. It is also emotional. It is also intellectual. It is also even spiritual. I'm reminded of the fact that there is so much cerebral, so much intellectuality in the love poems of Donne. Something remarkable, something which cannot be easily explained, except that Donne adopted a holistic approach to the experience of love, a comprehensive approach to the experience of love. John Dryden complained of Donne that he, Donne, perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with the softness of love. Unquote. The point is that in Donne, love is not unidimensional, is not monochromatic. It is comprehensive. It is totalizing. It succeeds in absorbing every aspect of the individual involved in that experience. Before I proceed any further, I would like to speak briefly about the theory of the dissociation of sensibility developed by T.S. Eliot in his essay, The Metaphysical Poets. T.S. Eliot claims that the English sensibility was unified to begin with, But then something happened. Between the time of Donne, between the time of Donne and the time of Tennyson, there was a dissociation of sensibility, a dissociation of the English sensibility, which could have been the result of the effects of the English Civil War. And it was aggravated by the influence of Milton, John Milton, and Dryden, John Dryden. T.S. Eliot upholds John Donne as a supreme example of the unified sensibility. A thought to Donne was something immediate, it modified his sensibility. The metaphysical poets had a sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. Put very crudely, what Eliot seems to be having in mind is a unification of thought and feeling, thought and sensation. Put very simply, or put very simplistically, Donne and his fellow metaphysical poets could not only think their thoughts, but also think their feelings. Not only feel their feelings, but also feel their thoughts. You find a comprehensive unification of sensibility in the metaphysical poets, including John Donne. The blossom is a spectacular example, a spectacular exemplification of the unified sensibility of John Donne. You have in the poem nature, the weather, the severe winter for which England is notorious, the Bible, the art of war, physicality, travel, friendship, and of course love. Not merely love, but love in all its glory. You have physical love, bodily love. You have emotional love, love from the heart. And I would even say that you have intellectual love because the last word of the poem is mind, as glad to have my body as my mind. There is no doubt that the vision of the poet is something holistic, something comprehensive, and that the unified sensibility of Donne, the capacity to unite thought and feeling, intellect and sensation, is brilliantly present in every aspect of the piece. I would like to focus critical attention on the stylistic aspects of the poem, beginning with its title. We have already discussed the title in some detail, and all that I would like to do here is to perhaps point out once again that it is a typical John Donne title, The Blossom, a title which deliberately raises false expectations in the reader. Expectations are deliberately raised in the mind of the reader, And these expectations are dashed to the ground by the body of the poem. A typical strategy adopted by John Donne. The Blossom, a short title, a simple title, a very ordinary title, an innocuous title, but also a title with tremendous potential. And once the potential is realized, you understand that the title is not so innocuous after all. The poem is organized in 5 stanzas. Each stanza consists of 8 lines. The lines are of varying length. Thus, the opening line is relatively short, and so is the third last line, that is the 6th line. The rhyme scheme is A B A B C C D D. Now we come to the rather tricky issue of scansion. The poetry of Donne frequently resists easy scansion, as is exemplified by the present poem, The Blossom. The meter is iambic. The iambus is a foot which consists of 2 syllables. The first of these is a short syllable. The second of these is a long syllable. Thus the foot consists of an unaccented syllable succeeded by an accented syllable. The iambus is the favorite of English poets, including Donne, because it is very close to ordinary English speech and it captures the richness of everyday English speech. So metrically the poem is iambic, but when I try to count the number of syllables, the number of feet, I run into problems. Sometimes it is iambic trimeter, 3 feet. At other times it is iambic tetrameter, 4 feet. There are even occasions when it is iambic pentameter, 5 feet. I am reminded of what Ben Jonson said of Donne in one of his conversations with the Scottish poet William Drummond of Hawthornden. This is what Ben Jonson is recorded as saying, I quote, "Donne, for not keeping of accent, deserved hanging." Unquote. I repeat, Donne, for not keeping of accent, deserved hanging. The diction is simple, ordinary, everyday. The rhythms are rough and conversational. This is only appropriate because the entire poem is actually a dialogue, is actually a conversation, is actually an interaction. And there cannot be any space in such a poem for something say, musical, or say, poetic in a conventional sense. The imagery is striking. It makes an indelible mark on the mind of the reader. The images are drawn from a wide variety of areas. For example, there is nature imagery, flower, sun, the cold weather. There is biblical imagery, the forbidden tree. There is war imagery, siege. There is travel imagery. And of course, there is the imagery of the human body. The poet makes brilliant use of anaphora or repetition early in the poem. The first line of the first stanza and the first line of the second stanza are identical except for one word, the last word. Little thinkest thou, poor flower, and little thinkest thou, poor heart. The poet makes very effective use of the device of the rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is a statement presented in the form of a question. It is actually a statement, but it takes the shape of a question and it is put in the form of a question, not in order to obtain an answer, but in order to make a point, in order to produce a dramatic effect. The poet makes use of the rhetorical question in the third stanza. If then your body go, what need your heart? He makes use of the rhetorical question in the penultimate stanza. How shall she know my heart, or having none, know thee for one? These are not questions posed in order to obtain answers, but posed in order to make certain points. The poet uses the figure of speech called the pathetic fallacy very impressively at the very opening of the poem. Pathetic fallacy is the attribution of human feelings and human responses and human processes to inanimate things and animals. The poem begins with the line, little thinkest thou, poor flower, which is obviously an excellent exemplification of the figure of speech. The poem makes powerful use of symbolism. The blossom, the flower, is certainly more than a blossom, a flower, in the literal sense. It is a symbol, and perhaps the most appropriate explanation would be that it stands for a woman. The forbidden tree is a symbol borrowed from the Bible. It symbolizes a relationship a possible relationship which is unacceptable to Christian morality, to the ethics of the Bible. Even the cowl, the freezing, in the penultimate line, the cowl, the freezing could be more than mere inclement weather. It could symbolize hostile circumstances. It could be a symbol for a situation that is completely negative and that works against the very existence of the blossom, of the flower, who by symbolic extension is the woman, in whom the heart of the speaker has a romantic interest. It has to be admitted that the poem is laced with an earthy humor and a misogynistic sarcasm. This brings me to the next point. In his groundbreaking study, The Enigmatic Narrator, the voicing of same-sex love in the poetry of John Donne, the American academic George Claviter tries to establish that John Donne was a great champion of same-sex love. George Claviter analyzes the blossom as an attempt to compare and contrast homosexual relationships and heterosexual relationships, and a misogynistic attempt at that. George Claviter observes that the blossom concludes with a paean to male relationships.